Meryl Streep was born with the name Mary, and the Louise part came from her mother's best friend, Louise Buckman. So that is where the Mary Louise came from. But she was always called Meryl, because her father made that name up on his own and he really liked it. Meryl herself actually hated it growing up. Hollywood is a place that puts certain people on a pedestal and calls them geniuses, but it also very often makes those same people pay for that position with pieces of their own heart. Meryl Streep, the woman the whole world refers to as the saint of cinema, has been acting for more than half a century without taking a single year off from the work. She holds 3 Academy Awards, dozens of roles that people will never forget, and a level of influence in the film world that very few people in history have ever been able to match. But behind all that brilliance and all those golden statues is a life that has been woven together with real pain and real scars that never fully went away. The greatest love of her life disappeared in an instant while she was holding him in her arms as he took his very last breath. A marriage that lasted more than 40 years ended in silence without any kind of dramatic announcement to the world. She has stood right in the middle of some of the most shocking scandals Hollywood has ever produced. She has been questioned and doubted and put in positions where one single wrong word could have wiped out everything she had spent decades building. And every role that looked so glorious from the outside was another time she had to tear herself completely apart in order to truly live inside someone else's pain. How does a woman stay at the very top of one of the world's most competitive industries while also walking through some of the deepest valleys of personal tragedy a human being can experience and still somehow keep moving forward without breaking? The answer to that question lives inside the story of Meryl Streep herself, the journey of an artist who took both her pain and her extraordinary talent and turned them together into a kind of light that absolutely nothing in this world has ever been able to put out. Meryl Streep was born in 1949 in a town called Summit in New Jersey, and she grew up inside what you might call a perfectly typical American middle-class family. Her mother was an amateur artist who loved creative things, and her father worked as an executive in the pharmaceutical industry. Everything about the way she grew up was steady and comfortable and sufficient in all the ways that mattered practically. But it was precisely that feeling of just enough and nothing more that left her moving through childhood with a sense of quiet calm that had a kind of blandness underneath it. Nothing was especially remarkable and nothing felt extraordinary about her daily life growing up. The part of her childhood that would end up mattering most was the quiet space she found inside an opera rehearsal room. When she was 12 years old, she began formal vocal training because she had this feeling deep inside that she needed to find something she could truly excel at, something that would let her escape that muted and slightly gray feeling that ordinary life gave her. Then in high school, she tried acting for the very first time in a school play, and something completely unexpected happened. She felt absolutely no nerves standing up in front of people. In fact, the stage made it easier for her to breathe than the real world ever had. That feeling was passion, but it was also something bigger than passion. It was the feeling that her soul had finally found the anchor it had been searching for without even knowing it. After graduating, she applied to Vassar College with the original plan of studying costume design of all things. But a theater professor named Clinton Atkinson encouraged her to audition for a very demanding play called Miss Julie, and she said yes. That one performance changed the entire direction of her life. A representative from the Yale School of Drama happened to be sitting in the audience that night, invited her to apply, and she got in. At Yale, she was not considered a standout student by any stretch of the imagination. Many of her classmates and instructors actually felt she was too reserved and too much in her own head, that she lacked the kind of theatrical flair that was expected. Meryl knew exactly what people thought, and she simply stayed quiet, kept observing everything around her, kept learning everything she could, and did more than her fair share of the work without drawing attention to herself. Not a single person watching that soft-spoken girl who kept her head down and stayed out of the drama could have imagined how far she was going to go. Maybe she could not even fully imagine it herself at that point. But when the Broadway stage finally opened its doors to her, she walked onto it carrying every ounce of quiet preparation she had been building up for years. It was a beginning defined by slow and steady steps and the kind of deep, patient commitment that earns lasting respect from the people who matter. In 1975, Meryl Streep stepped onto the Broadway stage for the first time in a play called Trelawney of the Wells. The role did not cause any kind of sensation or set the theater world on fire immediately, but it was more than enough for the people with truly trained eyes to stop and take notice. There was something genuinely and distinctly different about this blonde newcomer, a kind of emotional precision in everything she did that was completely unshowy on the surface and yet absolutely exact underneath. 2 years after that, she landed a small part in a film called Julia in 1977. But it was The Deer Hunter in 1978 that truly and completely changed everything about where her career was headed. In a film that was dominated by intense and largely silent male characters, Meryl appeared on screen as quiet and gentle as the spring, and it was that very specific gentleness that became an anchor for audiences as they watched the raw brutality of war corrode the souls of a group of young American men right before their eyes. Her actual screen time in the film was brief, but it was haunting in a way that stayed with people long after they walked out of the theater. And the film was made under personal circumstances that were almost impossible to describe. Her partner John Cazale was dying of cancer while they were filming, and Meryl had gone directly to the director and begged him not to fire John from the production so that he could keep working until the very end of his life. That same year she appeared in a television miniseries called Holocaust, and for the very first time Meryl Streep entered the homes of millions of ordinary Americans, not through an elite stage in a fancy theater but directly through the television screens in their own living rooms. The role earned her first Emmy Award, and then just 1 year after that she was standing on the Oscar stage for Kramer vs. Kramer in 1979, playing a mother who walks out on her child and then comes back fighting for custody. It was not the lead role in the film, but it was more than enough to make her an icon. The film brought her very first Academy Award, and yet it was also one of the most emotionally painful experiences she had ever been through in her professional life. Her co-star Dustin Hoffman actually slapped her for real on camera during filming, and certain scenes were deliberately manipulated by the director who provoked her real emotions by invoking the name of John Cazale, who had died not long before those scenes were shot. 3 years after that she took on Sophie's Choice in 1982, and she played a Polish woman who had survived the Nazi concentration camps and carried a secret so terrible it had broken something inside her permanently. The role was so emotionally harrowing and so psychologically demanding that many people in her life actually advised her to turn it down entirely just to protect her own mental health. But Meryl Streep did not look for excuses to step back from hard things. She looked for ways to get through them. She taught herself both German and Polish specifically for the role, lived in isolation for an entire month to immerse herself in the character, and gave herself over completely to the interior life of a mother who had survived Auschwitz and carried that experience inside her every day. The performance earned her first Oscar for Best Actress, and from that point forward, difficult and demanding roles seemed to find their way to Meryl Streep as if by some kind of silent design that was bigger than anyone's planning. A mysterious Victorian woman in The French Lieutenant's Woman in 1981. A factory worker turned activist in Silkwood in 1983. An aristocratic Danish author in Out of Africa in 1985. And an Australian mother named Lindy Chamberlain who was convicted of murdering her own baby after the child disappeared into the desert night in A Cry in the Dark in 1988. Not a single one of those roles was easy or comfortable or safe to take on, but not one of them was able to defeat her professionalism or her extraordinary and seemingly bottomless craft as a performer. By the late 1980s, an ironic and somewhat strange twist began to unfold in how people in the industry and in the press were talking about her. Meryl Streep's very mastery of acting had actually placed her inside a narrow and limiting box in the public imagination. She had become the symbol of serious, weighty films and educated cinematic sorrow. Some of the harsher critics were claiming that she was all technique, so precise and so controlled in everything she did that she lacked genuine spontaneous emotion underneath all that polish. Meryl disliked public arguments and squabbles, so instead of fighting back with words she set out to dismantle the limiting label other people had decided to put on her through the work itself, and the early 1990s audiences were genuinely startled to see her turn up in comedies like Postcards from the Edge in 1990. Where she played an actress struggling with addiction and trying desperately to escape the enormous shadow cast by her own famous mother, and Death Becomes Her in 1992, where she played a Hollywood socialite who becomes completely obsessed with finding eternal youth, essentially satirizing the very industry that had once put her on such a high pedestal. Then came the action thriller The River Wild in 1994, where Meryl was navigating raging river rapids both on the screen and in her real life as a performer, as if she was personally determined to prove to anyone still watching that she could do absolutely anything she set her mind to. Not every project during this stretch turned into a hit, but each role was a deliberate way of taking back control over how the world saw her and what it expected from her. Then came The Bridges of Madison County in 1995, and nobody dared to mock her as overly technical or lost under complicated makeup after that one. She became an Iowa housewife torn between the comfortable safety of her ordinary routine and the overwhelming pull of a passion she had never expected to feel. Meryl played Francesca with exactly the right amounts of hesitation, fear, and barely contained longing that so many middle-aged women carry quietly inside themselves and never talk about, and audiences genuinely wept. For the first time in years, Meryl Streep returned in full emotional force and touched the hearts of even the most skeptical and resistant viewers who had written her off as cold. From there, the roles kept coming as if some invisible current was carrying them to her one after another. Marvin's Room in 1996. One True Thing in 1998. The Hours in 2002. Then adaptation in 2002, where she played an eccentric author who was awkward and sensual and reckless all at once, and that performance earned her 13th Oscar nomination, which put her past the legendary Katharine Hepburn's record. But the true turning point that nobody had quite seen coming arrived when she was 57 years old and she became Miranda Priestly, the ice-cold editor-in-chief of a fashion magazine in The Devil Wears Prada in 2006. Miranda was a character who seemed villainous on the surface, but Meryl somehow found a way to fill her with an unspoken vulnerability that belonged to a woman so terrifyingly powerful that there was simply no room left in her life for any kind of weakness whatsoever. The whole world hated Miranda Priestly and feared her, and then walked away from the theater quietly wondering whether they might actually be just a little bit like her in ways they did not want to admit. And when people were already convinced that Meryl had reached the peak of what she was capable of, she went and sang and danced her way through Mamma Mia in 2008. And then turned around just months later and transformed herself into a stern and frightening nun in Doubt. Two characters that could not be more opposite from each other in every conceivable way, and she left audiences sitting in silent awe at both of them. She closed out the decade playing Julia Child in Julie and Julia in 2009, playful and eccentric and absolutely brimming with joy and life. Another Oscar nomination. Another undeniable proof that women past 60 years old do not need to step back from the spotlight or quietly fade away. They can explode onto the screen in ways that nobody saw coming and leave people completely breathless. By that point, it had become crystal clear that Meryl Streep was not changing herself to be loved more or to chase what audiences wanted from her. She was changing to keep herself alive inside the work, to keep giving something real to the audiences who had been loving her for decades. At an age when most performers would naturally begin stepping back and slowing down, Meryl stepped into an entirely new chapter of her career where each role was not just a professional.